I have the pleasure of introducing today's lunch keynote from Gavin Andresen. All right, I can see Gavin has a fan club here. And I don't really need to tell you that much about Gavin. Let me just say three things. He's the chief scientist at the Bitcoin Foundation. He's the lead developer of the Bitcoin software. And perhaps most importantly, he's an alumnus of Princeton University, class of 1988. So.
Thanks. I'm really happy to be here. Like Ed said, I am a Princeton alum. I have lots of fond memories of wandering back from a dark, dank basement in the E-Quad early in the morning after pulling an all-nighter working on my senior thesis in the computer science department. This was back before the PC revolution, so you actually had to go to where the machines were to do your work. I'm older than I look. The title of my talk is Consensus is Hard, and when I say consensus, I'm talking a little bit about the Bitcoin blockchain consensus, which is really the key to the whole Bitcoin system, is coming to a consensus on what are the valid transactions. And that's hard, but Satoshi figured it out. So that problem's solved. As lead developer for this project, there's another kind of consensus that's also hard, and that's kind of moving forward, making things happen, figuring out what the governance should be. That kind of consensus is also really hard. So I'm going to talk about three things today. I'm going to talk a little bit about me, my role in the project, and kind of how the project works. I'm going to talk about innovating or trying to innovate with a project that has gotten very big very fast, where mistakes are incredibly costly, not just to the people who might be making the mistakes, but to lots of other people too. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what I'm worried about for the Bitcoin project right now. And then I hope I'll leave lots of time for questions and answers, because judging from the previous panel, a lot of what I say might not be interesting to a lot of you, but we'll see. So I have to start with this cool picture, which is me in New Zealand. So I went on a vacation in New Zealand over Christmas. We were there for 3 weeks and went on a rafting trip with my family. And that rafting trip is the coolest thing I've bought for Bitcoin so far. And it's not just cool because New Zealand is a really awesome place, and this is a beautiful river. It was also cool because I didn't know that I was going to be able to pay with Bitcoin when I got on the raft. So that guy there, his name is Finn. That's actually his nickname, for Huckleberry Finn. He lives by the river. And when I got on the raft, I didn't realize that he was actually interested in Bitcoin. But halfway through the trip, somehow the subject of money and currency and financial systems came up, and he said the word Bitcoin, which really caught my attention. And I asked him if he knew about Bitcoin, and he said, yeah, I love Bitcoin. It's this cool, decentralized, more democratic form of doing money. And I confessed that I was the chief scientist of the Bitcoin Foundation, which I think stunned him a little bit. But we had a great conversation, and he was perfectly happy to accept what my wife used to call, pretend internet money for the trip. And I think that's, this little trip is kind of the first time my kids really realized, what their dad is doing is really kind of taking off. So a little bit about me and my background and how I got involved in this crazy project. Contrary to popular belief, I am not a cryptographer. Contrary to popular belief, I am not a security expert. So before Bitcoin, I was involved with Silicon Graphics. I joined Silicon Graphics Computer System, recruited right out of my bachelor's degree in computer science from here at Princeton, and I worked in Silicon Valley. I had a prior kind of 15 minutes of fame working on the VRML 3D graphics standard. Back then, I actually changed my name in 2000. I used to be called Gavin Bell. I'm now Gavin Andresen. But that experience informs kind of a lot of my kind of thinking about how Bitcoin should evolve. I can't, and I can talk more about that if you're interested. After Silicon Graphics, I did the typical Silicon Valley thing where I joined a series of small startups, some of which were utter failures, some of which were moderately successful. So I'm really a software engineer. My core competency, the thing I'm good at, is figuring out how to ship software products. And that sounds like it would be easy, but if you've ever tried to actually get a software project out the door that works for people, doesn't have horrible bugs, it's surprisingly difficult. And that is one of the things that I think I'm pretty darn good at. So the Bitcoin project itself has 5 core developers right now. And when I say core developer, I mean people who actually have write permission to our central source code repository. So there's Gregory, who's sitting there, Peter, Jeff, Vladimir, and me are the 5 people who control Satoshi's code, basically. So Satoshi created this open source software project in 2009, let anybody in the world use it, contribute to it, run it. And we're carrying forward Satoshi's code and concept, and that's kind of our job. When I say there are 5 core developers, I mean there are lots more people working on this code than just us 5. The last release, which we released just last week, had over 80 individual contributors who contributed some small or large piece of code to this, what we call the reference implementation, because as time goes on, just like the early internet, there used to be one implementation of a web browser, Mosaic, and there used to be one implementation of a back-end web server that would serve up web pages. That was the NCSA web server. I was around back then. I remember those days. But as the internet grew, there are more and more implementations that all interoperate and work together. And we're at that same early point with Bitcoin, where the reference implementation is basically the software that everybody's using now, but we're becoming increasingly decentralized as people re-implement or try to re-implement the software. So the theme of this conference is how do researchers and developers kind of interact more? How can we, be more, work better together? And I thought I'd have a slide just talking about how do us developers interact? What tools do we use? And we're really curmudgeons. We use internet relay chat quite extensively to talk to each other. So on any given day, you will find us in the Bitcoin Dev IRC channel on Freenode, typing away at each other, talking about specifically what should we do next. That's where the kind of engine room level business of Bitcoin gets done. Eventually things turn into GitHub pull requests. GitHub is just a centralized source repository where anybody in the world can go look at the Bitcoin source code. Anybody in the world can decide, I can make that code better. There's a process for submitting a pull request that any of the 5 core developers that have write access to the repository can then say, yes, that's a reasonable request. I'm going to pull in that change to the code. There is also a Bitcoin development mailing list. I'll talk a little bit more about development challenges and kind of noisiness or signal-to-noise ratio in the ways we communicate is a constant challenge. There's also email. It's very easy to find any of the core developers' email. Contrary to popular belief, we are not all anonymous hackers working underground. Our names and email addresses are easy to find. And finally, if you're a security researcher and you find what you think might be super serious bug in the protocol or something, you can always send us a PGP encrypted email. So there's a Bitcoin security mailing list that is invitation only for any serious security issues. Happily, that's an extremely low, low traffic mailing list. So our biggest challenge is trying to kind of change the tires on this car as it speeds down the road at 80 miles an hour. And the bigger the project gets, the harder that gets, and the kind of more it weighs on us to realize, what was maybe a $10 million software project when we first heard about it and started working on it is now this, $6 billion software project that we kind of hold the keys to. Previous panel talked about systemic risks, and that's certainly, the big challenge. And it's compounded by just the pure level of hype, right? You can buy a ticket to outer space with Richard Branson using Bitcoin. You get these, just in the last 6 months or so, the mainstream media has become incredibly interested in Bitcoin. So all of the Bitcoin developers, get approached by press people, get even people who aren't core Bitcoin developers. I know people who've contributed projects, even academics, get asked, is Bitcoin dead? So there's the huge hype. Everything's kind of cranked up to 11, and that's hard to deal with. It really is very chaotic, and from looking at the outside, and from somebody who started working, at a big company in Silicon Valley, this is the first open source software project that I've been deeply involved with, and it's a different way of working. It is organized chaos. I can't fire people if I don't like them, which is weird and hard, but it actually works pretty darn well. And looking from the outside, it is chaotic by design, and the idea is to try to let the good ideas flourish, to let the bad ideas die, but at the same time kind of keep the system, the fundamental system, reliable, keep it doing what it's good at, which is creating a block approximately every 10 minutes and validating transactions properly. So as we grow up, I'm thinking a lot about code review and testing. There doesn't seem to be any really good solution to this. I had a good conversation with one of the core Tor developers recently. We basically just commiserated about how hard it is to get developers to review each other's code, which is a real problem if you're a security critical project. So, there's no good answer there. It's kind of, we do the best we can. The Bitcoin Foundation, is a fairly new organization. It was very controversial when it was created. It's been very controversial recently because a couple of the people who are on the Bitcoin Foundation board turned out to be less reliable than you would hope. But from my perspective, the Bitcoin Foundation has been a huge force for good. So not just because they pay my salary, I am paid in Bitcoin, not just because they pay another of the core developers' salary, but because the foundation provides some kind of key infrastructure that really helps kind of lubricate the whole process. So for example, before the foundation existed, if I got contacted by a reporter asking me who knows what, something about reaction to the Silk Road or whatever the latest scandal is in Bitcoin, I had the choices of either ignoring them or taking time out of actually doing productive work to talk to them. Now I have a third option, which is send them to the press people who work full-time for the foundation, who can either direct them to the right people or just directly answer their questions. The foundation is really designed to kind of provide for the common good of Bitcoin. So some of the things it does are things like grants. If you have a great idea for some new piece of technology that you think would make the whole Bitcoin ecosystem better, that you can't get funding from Mark Andresen, the Bitcoin Foundation might be a good place to go to get a grant to help make that happen. One thing that's new is we have seen developers approached by law enforcement or regulatory agencies for either help with lawsuits or advice. And one of the things the foundation can provide is help arranging pro bono legal representation for Bitcoin developers. So if you're a Bitcoin developer and you get a call from the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, talk to folks at the foundation or send me an email and we can direct you to people who will make sure that you don't say something that might have you end up in jail, which is a good thing. And finally, one of the things the foundation is going to start experimenting with is fellowships. So at the Financial Crypto Conference, I announced that I'm going to be looking for a fellow to come to to come to Amherst and work with me for a year. I'll be looking for somebody who actually, has a proven track record of working in C++, and is a really uber geek who we can sketch out stuff on a whiteboard and then write some great code to solve some problems. This is a little bit, there's a tension here, right? The foundation doesn't want to be the central focus of Bitcoin. We really don't. We don't want the control. We want Bitcoin to remain a decentralized project. And that's one of the reasons why, for example, having somebody come work for me for a limited period of time makes sense. There are things that need to be done to the core code that we just don't have enough resources to do, but we don't want to create this huge centralized team to get them done. So we're going to experiment a little bit with ways that we might be more productive. Talking about change, you can't always change what you want. And I want to talk a little bit about kind of what can and can't be changed in Bitcoin, because one of the things I get asked by people who kind of don't work in software is, why do you need to change it at all? Isn't it done? And if you're a software developer, you know that code rots. I mean, you can't just leave code alone. Things change. The world is not a static place. So there are some things that can change in Bitcoin, some things that can't. The economics of Bitcoin can't change. We get people suggesting that maybe 21 million Bitcoins isn't enough, and maybe we should change that, or maybe the inflation schedule should be tweaked, or maybe we should make old Bitcoins go away because Satoshi has too many coins. All of those are kind of flat out no. If you go to the Bitcoin community and you suggest any of these changes, it's just the answer is no. You really can't experiment there. Those rules are really set in stone. A lot of people suggest maybe we should change the proof-of-work algorithm, that maybe we could use something that's not so amenable to ASICs. That's pretty much no also. I mean, there's a huge amount of hardware invested in Bitcoin at this point. I can talk more about what I think about centralized mining. I'll briefly say, I think the fears of mining becoming ultra-centralized are overblown. I think that hardware gets cheaper over time. I think Bitcoin hardware will get cheaper over time. And the off-the-cuff remark I like to say that isn't really true is that in 10 years you might get Bitcoin mining hardware in your box of Cracker Jacks. But I think that will be the trend. There are some changes to core consensus that are hard, but maybe could happen. So things like decreasing the 10-minute block interval. Maybe we want to go to 1-minute block interval, so we have 10 times as many blocks. It's not. Maybe I think we'll definitely need to increase the maximum block size at some point. There's this scalability issue of keeping track of what we call the unspent transaction outputs. It would be nice to kind of put a summary of those in blocks so you don't need the entire history of Bitcoin, all whatever it is, 12, 15 gigabytes worth, to kind of catch up with where things are. So those kind of changes can happen. They're hard. And you need to be incredibly careful. There are all sorts of kind of innovations that can happen at the transaction level. And I think it surprises a lot of people, but those are actually yes, I mean, we can change the transaction system. And it's not as hard as kind of core consensus changes, but if you come out with a change to the transaction system that's really well tested, that's thoroughly reviewed, and that is clearly useful, then yes, I don't see any barrier to kind of adopting those kinds of changes. So there are a lot of experiments with altcoins that are happening. Most of them not all that interesting. Most of them experiment with the economics. I would like to see more experiments in kind of the transaction level. Wallets, absolutely. This year is going to be the year of the multi-signature wallet. So in the previous panel talked a lot about the risk of losing your Bitcoins. We have the technology to make it much more secure to keep your Bitcoins, and we will see that technology come out this year. We will see much more secure wallets. I would say, be careful. I'd advise you to talk to a lawyer. If you're actually holding money for other people, then talk to a lawyer and make sure you understand what you're getting into. Maybe even talk to some lawyers who are familiar with like banking laws, and definitely learn from past mistakes. There have been InstaWallet was mentioned in the last panel, which failed miserably. Great product, pretty big failure. So we need to move past the one guy in his basement decides he can write a wallet application that holds tens of millions of dollars for people. That's not the right way to do it. And then network. This is one place where I haven't seen innovation, where I'd really like to see more innovation. So we have this peer-to-peer network that's surprisingly reliable, but could be better. And I would really like to see more kind of innovation on the how transactions and blocks are propagated, what the network topology is, all of that kind of stuff. I would really like to see more research, more innovation there. And that's pretty easy. You can have one network. We can have our existing Bitcoin network that sends blocks and transactions and running side by side. Another network technology that is also, and then you just have bridges in between so that transactions and blocks are transmitted across both networks. And I think in the spirit of diversity, that would keep me from staying up at night worrying about some bug in our network code that brings the whole thing crashing down. I'm pretty sure there aren't any, but it would be nice if there was more than one kind of network technology that we built on. So what am I worried about right now? I'm worried about transaction fees, actually. I've been working on what I call smart fees. So right now, the transaction fees you pay for Bitcoin transactions are hard-coded by us core developers. And we don't like that. We don't like making decisions. We would rather not make decisions whenever we can avoid making decisions. So I've actually been working on code so that transaction fees are a natural market, so that if there are more transactions on the network, they take longer to confirm in blocks, and the transaction fees will rise, which will tend to naturally decrease the number of transactions, because if transactions are more expensive, then we get fewer of them. There are a couple technical details I'm going to skip over. Optimizing how blocks are broadcast. This is very related to the problem with transaction fees, because miners right now have an incentive to make blocks that are fairly small, because blocks that are smaller, that include fewer transactions, propagate across the network faster. And if you're a miner, you want your block to be seen by as much of the network as quickly as possible. Because as soon as your block is seen, everybody starts building on your block as opposed to some other block. So there's work to be done to optimize the way blocks are broadcast. And I think there's even might be some interesting research here on kind of what are the theoretical limits of how quickly can we, give enough information to the network so that they can start doing useful work as quickly as possible. And there might be some interesting bandwidth and CPU trade-offs. So I'd actually like to see more research done on that. I mean, in the very short term, we'll probably do the best we can. And then finally, eventually we're going to run into this hard-coded 1 megabyte block limit. So each block in the Bitcoin network can be at most 1 megabyte big. And increasing that limit is a hard forking change, probably, unless we do it in a pretty ugly way. So this is actually a consensus change that I know is going to be really hard, and that I'm really not looking forward to, and that I've probably been procrastinating about talking about for at least 6 months because I know how hard it's going to be. But it's going to have to be done, and we're going to have to find a way to talk about it productively. So that's, that's kind of where my head is at right now, and what my big worry is. And I should say, even if we don't solve this problem, then Bitcoin does become a reserve currency. So, it's possible that it won't get solved. Transaction fees will just continue to rise, and only large transactions will be cleared across the Bitcoin network. And I personally don't want to see that. I don't think that's the vision of Bitcoin. I think the vision is this permissionless system where anybody can connect to the network and transact. So I'm going to be working really hard on trying to make sure that we can get there safely and with consensus. So that's all I have to say. I hope I have lots of time for questions.
So I'm very interested in the question of information propagation delay in the network, and Christian Decker et al. Have done some pretty interesting research. I know you've mentioned them. They were considering splitting the inv and the difficulty check when propagating transactions. But I also was curious what you thought about raising the default node connectivity from, let's say, 8 to 40. I know that increases the bandwidth requirements for running a full node. Do you think that's viable and a reasonable semi-solution to increasing the propagation of transactions?
The default right now is 128.
Okay.
So you see 8 a lot because that's how many outgoing you make. But each node will accept up to 100, I think it's 128. 125, sorry, off by 3. So I don't think that's an issue. I mean, we haven't seen any it was an issue before we added universal plug and play turned on by default. We were running out of kind of inbound slots because people had to actually tweak their routers.
Right.
But once we flipped that switch and made it automatically do the evil, nasty universal plug and play thing, that hasn't been an issue.
Okay, just one more question real quick.
Yeah, let me pass it around, then I'll come back. Excuse me.
Hi, not to put you on the spot, but I know you've talked a little bit about how you feel some of the players in the Bitcoin ecosystem are underinvesting in the core development, some of the companies, and so I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about sort of how you see which parts of the ecosystem should be stepping up and what amounts to fund the type of work that you guys are doing.
I mean, that's hard, because, and I think the big profitable players in the ecosystem are interested in supporting it. My default answer is join the foundation and have a higher level of membership, and if you're using the core code, then make sure your developers actually contribute back patches, make sure that they participate in the pull process, give them some time to actually help review code, to watch the changes that are being made. So I don't know, I think you were at the point where it's a whole bunch of startups, and having done startups for much of my career, I understand how hard it is for a startup to focus on anything besides getting that first product out the door and then making sure that product keeps working and scaling up. So yeah, it's a hard problem. It's a messy process. I don't have any magic answers.
Okay, let me ask a question myself, if I could. You mentioned before your experience with VRML standardization and how that has informed your work on Bitcoin. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, VRML actually became an international standard. So I went through the whole, I was the chief architect of the VRML spec. I wrote most of the VRML specification for doing 3D graphics on the web. And if you notice, there's not a whole lot of 3D graphics on the web right now. So while I'm proud of that work, and while it was interesting to take it through the whole, international standards organization, bureaucratic, fly to Fargo, North Carolina, and sit in a room for 2 days with people who were interested in 3D graphic standards on the web, I don't think that's the right path. I think you have to really start with useful applications. You have to do the experimentation. You have to figure out what works and what doesn't. I mean, if I were to do VRML again, it'd probably look like Minecraft, right? Which is very different from, the way we did it.
So you mentioned a little bit about, this is a bit more of a technical question, you mentioned a bit about sort of the systemic bugs that could cause huge problems. And recently in the IRC chat, I saw Greg Maxwell, and I think before that Peter Todd mentioned a specific bug about signature hash returning 1, and had it return 0, anyone could have stolen anyone else's Bitcoins, and the game would be over and all of that. I'm just sort of curious, what would the hypothetical response be in that instance? Would it be sort of a hard fork and sort of a scramble to outlaw that after a certain block number, or what would you do in that case?
Well, it's little known that in the early days of Bitcoin, actually not too long after I joined the project, we had a bug that would let anybody spend anybody else's Bitcoin. And back then, Satoshi was God, and Satoshi declared, everybody run this new code, I'm not going to tell you why. And if you look at the commit message, it was very cagey, and I think Satoshi and I and the guy who found the bug and reported it responsibly, kind of the three of us knew why, but nobody else did. And we're past that now. If that kind of bug did happen, yeah, you'd see a hard fork, very quickly. I think you would see kind of all transactions stop. We would fork the network. We would come out with new code, tell everybody run this code. Any transactions past this point, just a do-over. And then we would continue, and the price would take a huge hit. Bitcoin, faith in Bitcoin would take a huge dive. It would probably survive, but it would be really, really bad. So, I think that is what would happen. I mean, and the risk of that kind of bug is why I still tell people Bitcoin's an experiment and don't invest your life savings. And people always ignore me. But that is really true. And, I encourage people to still think of Bitcoin as, early bleeding edge technology. I think it'll still be, another couple of years. Maybe once we have 3 or 4 or 5, robust re-implementations, then I'll be more confident, telling people, this is something that where 99.999% confident, won't have some horrible bug that we managed to miss.
And so you mentioned that the miners nowadays, they don't have incentive to incorporate more transactions into the block because they want the block to transmit faster over the network. So on the other hand, they can get more transaction fees if they include more blocks. So are you suggesting that the transaction fees today are not enough to make up for the cost of slower slower propagation time? And also, what effect does this have on how long it takes for a transaction to be verified in the network? Because we know every block gets generated on average about 10 minutes. But does it take more than 1 epoch right now for a transaction to be verified?
So, I mean, the answer for the first part of the question for the fees is yes. I mean, the block subsidy of 25 Bitcoins vastly overwhelms the transaction fees that miners get for a block. So with the subsidy being so high right now, there's very little incentive for miners to include transactions with fees. In the long run, when that subsidy goes to 0, there will be an equilibrium where if a transaction has enough fees, yeah, it'll make the block a little bit larger and make it a tiny little bit less likely that it'll get orphaned. slightly more likely that it will get orphaned, that it won't be the winning block, and then you'll lose all the fees that you gathered up in the block. So there is an interesting kind of dynamic that will eventually happen. I mean, right now today, the problem is that 25 Bitcoin reward just overwhelms the fee. The second part of the question about transactions confirming, yeah, actually the work I've been doing on smart fees is showing me that average transaction confirmation time, if you use the hard-coded fees, are on the order of 3 or 4 blocks right now. So even if you pay the default, whatever it is, 0.1 millibit per kilobyte transaction fee, transactions are starting to kind of pile up, and until some nice miner decides to solve a large block and then kind of sweep up all those transactions and fees, it doesn't get confirmed.
I'm wondering if you could speak to a couple of the points that you brought up, I think specifically relating to your experience in having a useful application relating to VRML, your interest in, well, you started off the talk by a very practical implication of being able to use Bitcoin to pay for your rafting trip, and then your plea or your request to us for looking for innovative solutions relating to transactions. I can sort of asking you in general, what if you had the ability to say, I would like this form of innovation, is there anything that you are leaning towards specifically, if you think of it in terms of a go-to-market for Bitcoin and its ultimate adoption? What are you looking for from the development community to roll this out to a ubiquitous platform?
I mean, I'm incredibly heartened to finally see multi-signature wallets, which I mentioned. I think that is going to do wonders for keeping people's Bitcoins safe, and I'm really happy to see lots of innovation there. I mean, there's going to be work to, there's going to be chaos, lots of multi-signature solutions doing things slightly differently, communicating how the keys are sent around the network differently, and from that chaos, we're going to need to do some standardization, I think, so that kind of as things shake out, you'll have specialized services that are like credit card companies, and that they're scoring the risk of Bitcoin transactions so that if I'm paying for coffee, it knows I pay for coffee at this coffee shop every day, so boom, the transaction goes right through. If I'm paying 1,000 Bitcoins to some weird Bitcoin address that's associated with illicit activity, then maybe the company actually calls me and says, do you really want to let those 1,000 Bitcoins go through? And I say, oops, I just got hacked. So that's the thing I'm most excited about very short term. I mean, and I tend to focus on the very short term. I don't tend to look at smart contracts and distributed anonymous corporations and all these other interesting but maybe not quite ready for prime time uses, because there's plenty of really interesting uses that don't require huge leaps in technology and innovation.
What advice would you have for students who want to get involved with development for Bitcoin?
Be nice, be humble, be persistent. Realize that the people who have gone before you are incredibly busy, so be patient. But there's one of the wonderful things about open source development is we have no idea who's a student and who's been working in the field for 25 years, and we pretty much treat everybody the same. So if you do good work, if you create, really nice, well-structured pull requests, we will accept your code. We don't care if you're a freshman or, I'm looking at Greg, a longbeard. and a lot of really great code in Bitcoin Core has been written by students, which is fantastic. So, write good code, test it. Think about if you were standing in my shoes, you know, would you accept this code? But otherwise, yeah, go for it. I mean, it's really designed to be, you know, a little barrier to jumping in and starting.
I enjoyed your call to actions for innovations in networking and all these other parts of the Bitcoin protocol. My question is there room for non-technical contributions to the open source project? For instance, you know, how would one go about redesigning the core Bitcoin Qt app? Will there ever be a core Bitcoin designer on the team, or will it only be core developers? And kind of like, this is a personal addendum question, how did the first Bitcoin logo come about?
I think Satoshi actually created the first Bitcoin logo, if I recall correctly. He just posted it on the forums. And then people decided they didn't like it, and they reworked it and came up with other logos. And I mean, I haven't seen open source software projects ever be good at design. I don't know. Maybe there's an exception that I don't know about, but it just, you know, I mean, Apple is great at design. They're kind of the antithesis of open source. So design in particular, yeah, I think you'd be better off, you know, I think we are better off, you know, relying on kind of third-party wallets that are, you know, venture funded and are trying to get consumers. The reference implementation, we call it the reference implementation because we really intend for it to be kind of, you know, this is how you do things, but not necessarily how you make them look pretty. So, I mean, you could talk to Vladimir. Vladimir did the Bitcoin Qt GUI if you want to contribute. And actually, you know, one interesting career path, I think, these days is to make some, you know, valuable contributions to the Bitcoin core code. And if companies see you making valuable contributions to the core code, they're always looking for good programmers, good designers, you know, good talent. And so that's an easy way to prove your worth, and you are likely to get a job at, you know, one of these many Bitcoin companies that are starting up and doing really cool things.
Yeah, so you mentioned that you're looking into more research into the networking side of how the Bitcoin network operates. Like, that's really great to see. My question is, like, how high up is the scalability of the reference implementation itself? For example, like, it works great for individual users, but if you're a startup or you're building some service on Bitcoin, you need to do like thousands of transactions, or you're running like hundreds of Bitcoin daemons, you would end up writing custom code. And then you have forked the reference implementation, and you would end up, you know, doing your own thing. You're
poking me right in a sore spot. It's
right.
Like, right. That's so actually, Greg and I were just talking about this at breakfast. That the wallet code in the reference implementation needs to be rewritten, and we really, ideally, you know, there would be a red hat for Bitcoin. And I've been saying this for a while now. The foundation is not Red Hat for Bitcoin. I mean, we need a commercial company that is invested in, you know, just like Red Hat Linux took the open source software project, packaged it up nicely, provided training, provided, you know, kind of all the things that a company would need to, if they want to use Red Hat for whatever, you know, operating system in my cell phone, or you know, all the different things that Linux are used for. So we really need that for Bitcoin. And ideally, that company would have a team that, you know, is the production quality industrial wallet team that has the, you know, wallet software that was carefully designed to interact with, you know, all these enterprise level accounting systems and stuff that I know nothing about, right? That is a crying need. I'm hoping somebody someday will just have a startup that does that. But right now we're at this uncomfortable place where the reference implementation wallet code is kind of good enough. Like InstaWallet was using it and patched it and had hundreds of thousands of users, and then InstaWallet either collapsed or decided to run with the money or whatever. And, you know, maybe partly because, you know, they didn't have a really solid base to build on. So again, you're poking a sore spot where I don't have a good answer.
Hi. I know you said that you didn't want to change the proof of work, but I keep flashing back to that 100 megawatt number from before, which may or may not be an accurate estimate. But it seems to me that's a huge amount for society to spend for just a database insert. And when I look at it, I start to get the feeling like it's it's like maybe perhaps healthcare costs, and it'll consume more and more of society's energy usage if it on its current track. And I wonder if you think about that, or you have another argument against it, that it will all equilibrate out, or you don't even notice it at all.
I mean, it should. The amount of effort put into proof of work is proportional to kind of the value of the bitcoins that the miners are getting. And that should kind of level out, right? So as the block reward goes down, it'll all be transaction fees. Transaction fees are related to how many transactions are happening. So the only way miners will make money is by getting transaction fees from transactions that are happening. The idea is that transactions are valuable, right? I mean, that's why you'd be willing to pay a fee, is because they're valuable. Miners won't spend more processing those transactions to get the fees than it costs them. That'll be marginally a little bit more. So whatever cost is expressed in the mining, you can think of it as that is the value that people are getting from transacting using Bitcoin. So in the long run, I'm confident that the economics work out, and I'm not an economist either, but I think that rationale is correct. I think right now we have this crazy ramp-up period where there's all sorts of changes in mining, and we're in this race to smaller and smaller and more power-efficient mining hardware, and also in this huge ramp-up in people using Bitcoin, which is causing the price to go up, and all of that is contributing to kind of over mining, really, where we have too much mining at the moment. We're over. The network is overly secure, but long run, I think it will work itself out.
I'm just wondering, do you think bits of proof could be Red Hat for Bitcoin? And are there any other alternative implementation projects that you think are particularly promising or exciting?
Bits of proof seems to have stalled, and I think maybe the lead developer just wasn't good enough at kind of building community, and or the business side of things to scale up his business. The BTCD from the conformal system guys, which is a reimplementation in Go, that's interesting. I can't vouch for any other implementation, and the real hurdle is that if you get it wrong, if you're a miner and you decide to use something other than the reference implementation and you get it wrong, you solve a block, you think you have 25 bitcoins, and then it gets rejected by the network. That's a good chunk of money. So it's actually a pretty big risk to go with anything besides the reference implementation. And again, that's a hard problem. We make incremental progress to kind of smooth off rough edges that we find. And the process of people re-implementing Bitcoin in other languages and kind of stubbing their toe or falling on their face helps us find those rough edges. That's another really hard problem.
So a pretty contentious issue these past couple of weeks has been embedding extra data into the blockchain, and you guys have come up with op-return, provably prunable script that allows you to embed. It was originally 80, it was cut down to 40, and I know there's been a lot of contention about that. Where do you see the conversation going, and how can we kind of quell a lot of the concerns that various communities have, be it the Mastercoin counterparties, and where are you with that conversation?
I think it should be 42. No. I haven't seen a good argument for why you need more than 40 bytes. I mean, I've actually been very tempted to carve out time and write a post that says, so you want to use op return. Here's kind of how we think you ought to be thinking about it. And I think people tend to kind of bundle together a bunch of different things that Bitcoin gives you. So I mean, the blockchain gives you this nice ledger where transactions have a very particular order with a lot of consensus behind it. It also has this currency, which can be very useful if you want to worry about things like denial of service attacks, which I'm sure something like Mastercoin will worry about somebody flooding their network with gazillions of Mastercoin contracts just because they can, and if they can, they will. But like those two pieces of functionality don't necessarily need to be, well, and then there's kind of the data storage, which op return gets at a little bit, which a lot of people kind of get excited about of, this huge ledger all over the world that's nice and distributed, and I don't need to worry about somebody knocking over their hard drive and my whole database of all the transaction goes away. That just doesn't happen with Bitcoin because it's everybody's hard drives everywhere. But if you kind of separate out those pieces of functionality, I think you can design very interesting systems where you use the blockchain ledger to kind of put a pointer, a hash, to some data that's stored reliably, not in the Bitcoin blockchain, but somewhere else. And that's kind of a building block that I think you can do all sorts of really interesting things on. And quite frankly, I think some of these other systems are just being lazy, and they're not. They're building things the way they are because it's convenient, not because it's kind of conceptually the right way to do it. And if I could go back and design Bitcoin from scratch, maybe all the Bitcoin transactions wouldn't actually be in the blockchain. Maybe it'd be nothing but hashes, and there'd be some other distributed data structure that would store them. I don't know. That's neither here nor there because we can't do that. But if you are designing a new system, you do have more freedom.
Yeah. So I just wanted to say thanks for the work you're doing. That's the first point.
You're here.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And to follow on that, the attitude you have about the community is also important. I know it instills a culture about the whole project, and it's just important to reflect that and recognize that. Specific question, just to ask about op multisig. That's awesome and great. I'm glad that's there. Are you planning to leave it 2 of 3, make it truly M of N? How much can you jam in that little piece, or just daisy chain it? Or
well, there's some really interesting research going on here at Princeton for threshold ECDSA signatures, which I'm really interested in and excited about. So we may not need to ever go more than 3 because there may be better ways of doing it. And I see a...
I'm afraid we're out of time. You've been very generous with your time, and we've gone a little bit over. But we'll take that out of the break. Anyway, we'd like to thank you, Gavin, very much for this rare opportunity for this conversation.